December 5th, 1944. Brock's Department Store, Omaha, Nebraska. The air smelled sharp, floor polish, cedar, and a faint, sweet cloud of perfume from the ground floor. The silence was heavy, broken only by the low, metallic hum. Hana gripped Yuki's arm, pulling the younger woman slightly behind her as Corporal Evans, a man too young for his baggy uniform, gestured impatiently. He was holding the glass door open, a ritual of American courtesy that still felt like a trap. "He means, now, Hana-san," Yuki whispered, her eyes fixed on the impossible sight. "Are we meant to ride this?" Hana stared at the Ugoku Kaiden, the moving stairs. They flowed upwards into the darkness, a river of polished steel. "Daijobu," Hana whispered, though her own heart hammered. "It is only metal." These forgotten perspectives challenge what we think we know about the war. We invite you to subscribe to Unheard Voices of War and share which country you're watching from today. 6 weeks earlier, Camp Alliance, Nebraska. The brakes of the olive drab bus hissed, releasing a cloud of steam into the frozen air of late October. Camp Alliance, Nebraska, 1944. Hana Ishii pressed her forehead against the vibrating glass, watching the landscape that had remained unchanged for 3 days. Sky, flat earth, and now fences. The wire was new, stretched tight between thick wooden posts under the weak afternoon sun. "Everyone, out! Hayaku!" The guard at the front barked the Japanese word, but his accent mangled it, turning the sharp command into something dull and heavy. The women moved stiffly, their bodies aching from the long transit. Hana kept a protective hand on the back of Yuki, a girl of 19 who had been a nursing assistant in Manila. Yuki was trembling, less from the cold and more from the stories they had whispered to each other in the dark holds of transport ships. Stories of American monsters who took pleasure in cruelty. They were marched into a long, low building that smelled overwhelmingly of lye soap and boiled potatoes. A sign was posted on the wall, printed in English and, surprisingly, in precise Japanese. Notice to civilian internees. All procedures governed by the Geneva Convention, 1929. Hana read the Japanese text aloud for the women who were illiterate. It spoke of rights, of inspections by the Swiss legation, of correspondence. It seemed like a bureaucratic fantasy, completely disconnected from the armed men surrounding them. They stood in line. A young, freckled soldier, he looked younger than Yuki, processed their names from a list, his pencil moving slowly. He did not look at their faces. This, Hana decided, was the true enemy. Indifference. It was colder than the Nebraska wind. They were ordered to strip for a medical inspection. The women huddled together, shame warring with fear. But the inspection was brief, conducted by a stern army nurse who seemed more interested in delousing powder than interrogation. Afterward, they were issued supplies. An older guard, his face lined like dried mud, manned the supply cage. He threw items onto the counter. 2 gray shifts of coarse cotton, a bar of soap, a thin towel. When Hana stepped forward, he tossed the items at her. She flinched, expecting a blow or a curse. Nothing. He just pushed the items toward her. He looked past Hana to Yuki, who was shaking visibly, her teeth chattering. The guard sighed, a sound of profound boredom. He turned, grabbed a second wool blanket from the stack behind him, and threw it onto the pile. It landed with a soft thud. Hana froze. It was an extra ration, a violation of the expected script. "Take it," the guard grunted, not meeting her eyes. Hana slowly reached for the blankets. They were rough, smelling powerfully of the same lye soap that permeated the building. It was not the smell of death or decay. It was the smell of institutional cleanliness. That night, in the dark barrack, Yuki cried silently into the extra blanket. Hana lay awake, staring at the wooden slats of the bunk above her. The wind howled outside, pressing against the thin walls. The propaganda had promised devils. But the guard's gesture had not been kindness. It had been impatience. It had been the dismissal of an adult dealing with a troublesome child. She pulled the coarse wool tighter. It was heavy, and it was warm. Hana was not prepared for this. She was prepared for brutality. She was not prepared for the complex, unsettling neutrality of the clean wool blanket. 6 weeks passed. The brutality Hana had braced for never materialized. It was replaced by something far more corrosive: monotony. The days at Camp Alliance bled into one another, distinguished only by the thickness of the frost on the windows. The routine was rigid, governed by bells and whistles. Wake, roll call, watery oatmeal, barrack cleaning, watery soup, laundry detail, watery stew, roll call, sleep. The Geneva Convention, Hana learned, was not a shield against cruelty so much as a guarantee of structured boredom. The clean wool blanket remained a simple object of warmth. Nothing more, nothing less. They were ghosts haunting their own lives. Then, on a Tuesday in early December, the routine broke. After the morning meal, a sergeant accompanied by Mr. Okabe, an older Japanese-American Nisei who served as the camp interpreter, entered the mess hall. A notice was pinned to the bulletin board. The sergeant spoke, and Mr. Okabe translated, his voice flat. "The camp commandant," Mr. Okabe announced, "in accordance with international agreements regarding paid labor for civilian internees, has approved a new work detail." Silence. The women stopped eating, their spoons hovering over their tin bowls. Work. The word landed like a stone. "This detail is voluntary," Mr. Okabe continued, though his eyes scanned the room as if expecting no volunteers. "Transportation will be provided. Compensation will be issued in camp scrip, redeemable at the G commissary." A woman named Chio, who had been a teacher in Guam, spoke first. "What work, Okabe-san?" The interpreter cleared his throat. "The detail is non-military, general labor." This vagueness was all the confirmation they needed. Whispers erupted. "Kojo, a factory. Danyaku, munitions." "It is a trick," Chio hissed to Hana. "They mean to make us build weapons to kill our brothers. It is a violation." Hana watched the American sergeant. He was chewing tobacco, seemingly oblivious to the quiet panic he had caused. He looked bored. If it were a munitions factory, she reasoned, would he be so relaxed? Or was this too part of the performance? "Yuki," Hana whispered, "do not look frightened. Look empty." "I cannot, Hana-san," Yuki whispered back, her knuckles white on the edge of the bench. "Mr. Okabe," Hana called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The room fell silent again. The Geneva Convention requires specificity. "What is this general labor?" The sergeant spat a brown stream into a nearby can. He muttered to Mr. Okabe. The interpreter looked down at his clipboard, as if the words themselves were embarrassing. "The detail is for a civilian contractor, in the city, after business hours." "What is the work?" Hana pressed. Mr. Okabe finally looked up. His gaze met Hana's. "Cleaning. 6 nights a week. You will be cleaning a department store." The revelation was so anticlimactic, so utterly bizarre, that it was met with confused silence. "A department store, Hyakaten." Chio scoffed. "They mock us. They have us scrubbing floors while they shop?" "No," Mr. Okabe said, a faint note of irritation entering his voice. "After hours, the store is closed, empty. Brack's department store in Omaha." The specificity was disarming. It was not a factory. It was not a military base. It was a shop. Hana looked around. The women were confused, their fear momentarily replaced by bewilderment. "Why?" Yuki whispered. Hana did not have an answer, but she knew one thing. It was not the barrack. It was not the laundry room. It was not the smell of boiled potatoes and lye soap. It was a way out, if only for a few hours. "I will go," Hana said, standing up. Yuki gasped, then stood immediately. "I will go too." One by one, 6 other women rose. The sergeant made marks on his roster. "Bus leaves at 1900 hours, Mr. Okabe said. As they left the mess hall, Chio grabbed Hana's arm. "Be careful, Ishii-san. They are showing you the store for a reason. They want to show you what you have lost. They want to break your spirit." "My spirit," Hana replied, pulling her thin coat tighter, "is already worn thin. Perhaps it needs to see something new." The bus that arrived at 1900 hours was not a military transport. It was a repurposed school bus, painted a dull gray, its windows rattling in their frames. The guard assigned to their detail was a young man named Corporal Evans. He was thin, with acne scarring his jawline, and he carried his rifle with a self-conscious awkwardness, as if it were too heavy for him. He counted them, 8 women in total, and motioned them aboard with a jerk of his chin. "No talking. Sit away from the windows," was his only order. Hana sat on the cold vinyl seat, Yuki beside her. The bus smelled of diesel fumes and damp wool. As they cleared the camp gates, Hana felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Chio's warning echoed in her mind. They want to break your spirit. For 20 minutes, the bus moved through total darkness, rattling over the frozen farm roads of the high plains. Then, lights appeared on the horizon. Not the dim, functional bulbs of the camp, but a glow. They entered the outskirts of Omaha. Despite the late hour and the wartime dim-outs, the city was alive. Neon signs buzzed in reds and blues, advertising beer and motor hotels. Cars moved slowly along the streets, their headlights casting weak beams. Hana instinctively leaned back, away from the glass, but she could not stop herself from looking. She saw civilians walking, bundled in thick coats. They looked well-fed. Their movements were confident, unhurried. At a stoplight, a group of men in factory overalls stood on the corner, smoking. One of them noticed the gray bus. He squinted, then saw the women's faces through the glass. His expression curdled. He pointed, and the other men turned. They did not shout. They did not throw anything. They just stared. It was a cold, hard, unified stare of pure contempt. Yuki shrank against Hana, pulling her coat over her head. Hana forced herself to remain still, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to meet their eyes. She felt like a creature in a traveling zoo, paraded through the streets for the amusement and disgust of her captors. The bus moved on, but at the next corner, and the one after that, it was the same. A woman pulling a wagon stopped and spat on the pavement as they passed. The bus turned onto a main thoroughfare, and Hana saw it. A massive multi-story building illuminated by spotlights. Barracks. As the bus slowed, Hana glanced at the floor. Kicked into the aisle was a wadded piece of newspaper. She could read the masthead, Omaha World Herald. Below it, a headline blared, "Marines face hell on Peleliu." And beside that, a smaller column, an editorial. She could only make out the title, "Why Are We Coddling the Enemy in Our Own Backyard?" She felt a chill colder than the night air. This was the voice of the people staring at them. She looked up at Corporal Evans, who was slouched near the driver. He was watching her. He had seen her read the headline. He knew what it meant. Evans held her gaze for a moment, his face impassive. Then he looked away, out his own window, as if dismissing her, the newspaper, and the town outside all at once. His indifference was, in its own way, a shield. He was not there to protect the town from them. He was there to deliver a work detail and prevent escape. Nothing more. The bus rumbled into a dark alley and stopped at a steel loading dock at the rear of the great building. "Out!" Evans ordered. his voice cracking slightly. The silence of the alley was heavy. The stares of the civilians were gone, replaced by the looming dark brick of the store. Hana ushered Yuki out, her heart pounding. The hostile town was behind them, but she felt they had just traded one cage for a much larger stranger one. Corporal Evans unlocked the heavy steel door with a jangling key. The air that rolled out from the darkness was not the damp, cold air of the alley. It was warm, dry, and carried an almost overpoweringly complex scent. Beeswax polish, cedar wood, and a faint, sweet cloud of lavender. It was the smell of a world they had been told no longer existed. Evans flicked a bank of switches. It was not the full, dazzling illumination of daytime, but a series of functional work lights that cast long, unsettling shadows. The women stepped inside, one by one, and stopped dead. They stood at the edge of a vast, polished marble floor. In every direction, under canvas dust covers, or gleaming behind thick panes of glass, was more. It was a kingdom of things. The silence was absolute, heavier than the silence of the camp barracks. Here the silence was respectful, as if they had entered a shrine. They were surrounded by dozens of pale, smiling figures, mannequins, frozen in elegant poses, draped in silk dresses and fur-collared coats. They wore hats with delicate veils and held leather handbags in their plaster hands. Hana stared at a single rack of women's blouses, more clothing than she had seen in her entire village. She thought of her mother's kimono, patched twice at the elbow, the fabric worn thin as paper. She thought of the single wool blanket back at the camp, the one she had clutched for its utilitarian warmth. Here, blankets were stacked in piles, dyed in colors Hana had forgotten existed. This was not a store. It was an assault. The other women were paralyzed, their mops and buckets forgotten at their feet. Two women began to weep, quiet, horrified sobs. "Hey!" Evans barked, his voice unnaturally loud in the space. "Mops? Floor? You know, Soji." He made a scrubbing motion, but they seemed incapable of moving. Yuki, her eyes wide, drifted away from the group as if in a dream. She moved toward the cosmetics counter, a fortress of glass and mirrors. Gold-topped bottles were arranged in perfect, glittering armies. She stopped in front of a display of perfume. The liquid inside was the color of pale amber. Slowly, as if mesmerized, Yuki raised a trembling hand. She extended one finger, not to steal, but simply to touch the cool, smooth surface of the glass, to confirm it was real. "Dame!" Hana's whisper was sharp as a knife. She grabbed Yuki's wrist, pulling the hand back forcefully. Yuki flinched, gasping, shame flooding her face as the trance broke. "Do not touch anything," Hana commanded, her voice low and fierce. "We are not here to look. We are here to work. Do you understand? Look only at the floor." She released Yuki's arm, but as she turned away, Hana's own gaze was caught by the endless displays. Rows of polished leather shoes, stacks of furniture, entire kitchens waiting for owners. She had been prepared for bombs. She had been prepared for starvation. She had even, in her darkest moments, prepared for execution. She was not prepared for this casual, impossible abundance. Chio's warning had been wrong. The Americans were not trying to break their spirit by showing them this. They did not need to. This was their world. This ocean of surplus, this careless luxury, existed simultaneously with the foxholes and ration lines of her homeland. A wave of profound, sickening despair washed over Hana. It was not anger. It was resignation. If a nation can waste this much beauty, she thought, her stomach clenching, if this is their normal, the war is already over. "First floor," Evans called out, checking his watch. He was impatient. This was just a job to him. "Mop the main aisles. You have 1 hour. Then we moved to housewares on the second floor. The women finally bent to their tasks. The harsh, chemical smell of the cleaning solution rose from the buckets, a familiar scent of labor. It briefly masked the perfume, but it could not erase the sight. They began to scrub the marble floors, ghosts mopping a palace. The hour concluded. The mops and rags ceased their rhythmic work. The ground floor's marble expanse gleamed under the work lights. Corporal Evans made a cursory inspection, his boots squeaking on the clean surface. He seemed satisfied, or at least no longer annoyed. "All right," he said, shifting the rifle on his shoulder. "Gotta finish housewares. Second floor, let's go." He led them away from the perfumed counters and the kingdom of mannequins, toward the center of the vast, hollow building. Here the store opened up into a grand atrium. The upper floors were visible as stacked balconies, their brass railings catching the dim light. Evans stopped. The women stopped behind him. Hannah looked around. She saw a wide, traditional marble staircase curving gracefully into the shadows far to their right, but Evans was standing before something else. It was a machine. It resembled a staircase in function, but its steps were made of grooved, interlocking metal. It sat within a sloping, polished casing. It emitted a low, steady hum, a sound of contained energy, the same sound she had noted when they first entered. And it was moving. The steps rose slowly from a gap in the floor, ascended smoothly into the darkness of the second level, and vanished, only to be replaced by new steps in an endless, silent loop. The mops and buckets clattered onto the marble floor. Yuki grabbed Hana's arm, her fingernails digging into the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Hana-san," she hissed, her voice strangled. What is it?" Hana had no answer. She had seen photographs of factory assembly lines. Was this some kind of conveyor for cargo? Was it meant for heavy crates, not people? The metal teeth on the steps looked sharp, designed to grip, or perhaps to grind. She imagined the gears churning beneath the floor. "It is a trap," Chio whispered from behind, her voice terrifyingly certain. "It will shred us." Evans turned. Impatience etched onto his young face. He saw the 8 women, frozen, staring at the machine with the same raw terror as if he had ordered them to step into a furnace. "What's the problem now?" he snapped. "It's just stairs." "Kaidan." He pointed upward. "Second floor. Move." No one moved. Evans let out a long, frustrated sigh. "Jesus H. Christ." He muttered something about wasting time. "Look, it's fine. It's for people." He turned, took one long stride, and stepped onto the moving tread. His body glided away. He balanced easily, one hand resting lightly on the black rubber handrail that moved with him. In seconds he ascended, shrinking, until the machine swallowed him over the edge of the second floor. The silence he left behind was heavier than the hum. He was gone. His voice echoed down from the atrium, disembodied. "Well, come on!" Hana stared at the void where he had vanished. She stared at the flowing river of metal. This was not a tool of war. It was a tool of leisure. They had tamed steel, she thought, made it serve them this lazily. Yuki, trembling beside her, finally voiced the question that paralyzed them all. "Are we meant to ride this?" Evans's voice echoed from above, sharp with impatience. "I ain't got all night. Get up here, or you're all on report." The threat hung in the perfumed air. A report meant punishment. It meant a return to the gray barracks, perhaps solitary, perhaps the loss of meager privileges. More than that, it meant failure. Hana felt the stares of the other 6 women, all looking to her. She was the one who had spoken up in the mess hall. This was her detail. She looked at the machine. Ugoku Kaidan, the moving stairs. The sound was the worst part. That low, constant, oily hum. It was the sound of power, effortless and indifferent. She watched the point where the metal steps emerged from the floor, perfectly formed, rising up to meet them. She watched them disappear at the top, folding into a hidden mechanism. Chiyo's whisper came again. "It is a grinder, Hana-san. For animals." "It is for shoes," Hana snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "American shoes." She looked at Yuki. The younger woman was rigid with terror, her face pale, tears welling in her eyes. She was paralyzed. Hana knew that logic would not work. Brutality would not work. Only authority. She straightened her back. She would not be defeated by a staircase. She grabbed Yuki's hand. It was ice cold and slick with sweat. "Ikuzo," she said. "We are going." Yuki shook her head, trying to pull away. No, I cannot. Hana-san, please." Hana tightened her grip, pulling Yuki forward until they stood at the very edge of the moving plates. The first step slid past them, then another. They moved slower than a walking pace. "Daijobu," Hana said the word firmly, as much for herself as for Yuki. She stared at the black rubber handrail, not the moving teeth at her feet. "It is only metal." She took a short, sharp breath. She thought of the cold Nebraska wind, of the hostile faces in the town, of the endless gray soup. This was better. This was different. Closing her eyes, she lifted her foot. She did not step onto it. She allowed it to take her. There was a disorienting lurch, a feeling of weightlessness as the step collected her foot and began to lift. She stumbled, her balance gone. Yuki screamed, a short, thin sound that was instantly swallowed by the atrium. Hana's free hand shot out and clamped onto the rubber handrail. It was solid. It was stable. And it was moving with her. The sensation was shocking. She pulled Yuki fully onto the step beside her. The younger woman collapsed against her, sobbing, her eyes squeezed shut. Hana held her up. She held the rail. She waited for the grinding, for the pain. Nothing. After 3 seconds, her heart, which had hammered against her ribs, began to slow. The terror did not vanish, but it subsided, replaced by a profound electric curiosity. She opened her eyes. The ground floor was falling away beneath her. The polished marble squares were shrinking. The abandoned mops and buckets looked small, like forgotten toys. She looked up and saw Corporal Evans waiting, leaning against the brass railing of the second floor, his expression one of complete boredom. The movement was smooth. It was smoother than the rattling bus. It was a perfect, steady, mechanical glide. There was no vibration. There was no danger. She was rising. She was flying, slowly, up toward the lights of the next floor. She looked at the polished wooden panels of the escalator's casing gliding past her. She felt the cool air moving against her face. She was riding the Ugoku Kaidan. The ascent lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like a separate pocket of time, disconnected from the war and the camp. As they neared the top, Hana watched the grooved metal steps in front of them disappear, one by one, folding flat before sliding into a grated slot in the floor. A steel plate, ridged like a comb, waited for them. "Lift your feet," Hana ordered, pulling Yuki upright. They reached the top. Hana stepped forward onto the solid, stationary floor of the second level. The transition was jarring. She felt a brief, vertiginous wobble as her body, accustomed to the glide, reacquainted itself with stillness. She stumbled, catching herself on a display of kitchen knives. Yuki, clinging to her, stumbled with her. The younger woman tripped over her own feet, lurching forward onto the polished linoleum. She did not fall, but the sudden combination of fear, relief, and kinetic confusion proved too much. A sound escaped her. Not a sob, but a high-pitched, involuntary giggle. It was a sound of pure, childlike astonishment. Yuki clapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror at her own lapse in discipline. Corporal Evans, standing nearby, just shook his head, looking completely baffled by their reaction. But Hana barely noticed him. She was focused on Yuki. The giggle, quickly suppressed, echoed in Hana's ears. It was the most human sound she had heard in months. It was the sound of a person who had momentarily forgotten to be a prisoner. One by one, the other 6 women followed, their terror having evaporated as they watched Hana and Yuki arrive unharmed. They stepped off the machine with clumsy, awkward motions, but their faces were not fearful. They were stunned. Chio, the skeptic, was pale. Her lips parted as she looked back at the machine that had delivered her. Hana turned and looked back as well. The Ugoku Kaidan continued its effortless, steady climb. It was still humming, a low, consistent, mechanical purr. It did not care that they had ridden it. It was built for one purpose: to move people from a lower place to a higher place, purely for convenience. She thought of the propaganda posters back home. They had shown American soldiers as fang-toothed demons, Capitol buildings in flames, and a nation starving. They had never shown this. This machine was not a weapon. It was not cruel. It was, in its own way, far more terrifying. It represented waste. It represented an excess of power, an excess of material, an excess of ingenuity, all dedicated to something as trivial as shopping. A nation that could build moving stairs just to sell hats and kitchen knives, Hana realized, was a nation that operated on a level of reality she could not comprehend. This was the true enemy. Not the indifferent Corporal Evans, or the hostile civilians, or the clean wool blanket. The true enemy was this effortless, shining, humming symbol of soft power. It was a power so vast it did not even need to be cruel. It simply was. You gonna stare at it all night, or you gonna clean? Evan's voice broke the spell. He pointed down a long aisle filled with gleaming white refrigerators and stoves. The housewares department. Hana pulled Yuki to her feet. The girl was still flushed, her eyes bright. "Gomen nasai, Hana-san," Yuki whispered, ashamed of her laughter. Hana said, her voice quiet but firm. She handed Yuki a rag. "It is fine." She looked back at the escalator one last time. It had not broken her spirit, as Chio had warned. It had vaporized it. It had replaced her rigid certainty with a vast, hollow, unsettling doubt. She turned toward the refrigerators. "Work," she ordered. For 2 hours, they polished. They scrubbed the surfaces of gleaming white ovens and wiped fingerprints from the doors of refrigerators that stood like silent, cold sentinels. This work was easier than mopping. It was intimate. They were touching the objects of an American home, items so luxurious they felt like stage props. Hana ran her rag over a chrome-plated toaster, its surface curved like a mirror. She saw her own exhausted, drawn face reflected back. She looked alien in this bright, clean world of domestic machines. At 2:45 a.m., Corporal Evans tapped the face of his watch. "All right, stow the rags. We're done." A collective sigh of relief went through the women. Their backs ached, and their hands were raw from the cleaning solutions. They gathered their supplies near the central atrium. And there it was. It was not the same machine, but its twin, situated a few yards away. This one flowed constantly, relentlessly, down. The Ugoku Kaidan that went up had been an invitation to a strange new territory. The one going down looked like a metallic waterfall, a chute into darkness. Looking down its moving length created a dizzying optical illusion, a sense of falling forward. Yuki, who had regained her composure scrubbing sinks, instinctively recoiled, her brief flicker of laughter long forgotten. Chio stared at it, her arms crossed, not with terror this time, but with a cold, analytical curiosity. Evans, anticipating another delay, opened his mouth to bark an order. He never got the chance. Hana walked straight past him. She did not pause. She did not grip Yuki's hand. She simply approached the top step, watched for a brief second as it flattened and moved away from her, and stepped onto it. The handrail slid coolly under her palm. The feeling of descent was immediate. She looked down, watching the polished brass dividers between the steps flicker past. It was not control. She knew she was not controlling the machine, but it was acceptance. The fear was gone, replaced by a weary understanding. This machine was not her enemy. It was not her friend. It was simply a fact. Like the cold wind of Nebraska or the wire on the fences, it was a tool built by people who had so much power they could afford to waste it on convenience. She felt, rather than saw, the other women step on behind her. They followed her lead without a sound. The ride down was quiet, meditative. They descended together, a small, tired cluster of gray-clad women gliding silently through the heart of the sleeping store. They passed the mannequins on the ground floor, their pale, smiling faces seeming to mock them in the dim light. They stepped off onto the marble floor. The journey was over. They collected their original mops and buckets, their movements quick and practiced. Evans led them back through the darkness of the stockroom and into the freezing air of the loading dock. The transition was brutal. The warm, perfumed, humming world was sealed behind the steel door, and the raw, cold night rushed in. The bus ride back to Camp Alliance was conducted in absolute silence. No one whispered. No one wept. Hannah stared out the window, but she did not see the hostile, dark town passing by. She was no longer afraid of the civilians and their angry newspapers. Their hatred was simple, human, and understandable. It was hot, like a fire. But the store was cold. The escalator was cold. Its power was systematic, indifferent, and absolute. It was a power that did not need to hate. Hannah leaned her head against the cold glass of the bus window, the rattle of the engine vibrating through her skull. She could still feel the phantom sensation of the smooth, steady glide, pulling her upward, pulling her down. They filed off the gray bus in the pre-dawn chill, their footsteps crunching on the frozen gravel of the compound. The searchlight from the guard tower swept over them, pinning them in its white glare before moving on. Corporal Evans marched them to the door of Barrack 4 and watched as they entered, his responsibility for them ending for the night. The door swung shut, sealing them back into the world they knew. The change was immediate and violent. The air in the barrack was thick, hot, and stale. It smelled of unwashed bodies, chamber pots, and the lingering odor of boiled cabbage from the evening meal. After the clean, sharp, perfumed air of the department store, it was suffocating. Most of the women in the barrack were asleep, their breathing a chorus of low whistles and deep snores. But a few were awake, huddled near the central stove, waiting. Mrs. Sato, an older woman who had been the wife of a colonial administrator, was the barrack's unofficial matriarch. She looked up as they entered, her eyes sharp and suspicious. "Well?" she demanded, her voice a low rasp. "They did not take you to the munitions factory then?" The 8 women of the work detail did not answer. They moved quietly, automatically, removing their coats and boots. They were exhausted, but it was a new kind of exhaustion, one of the mind, not just the body. Yuki, however, was still vibrating with a strange, nervous energy. She was too full of the night's sights to remain silent. "Sato-san," she whispered, walking toward the stove, her face illuminated by the red glow from its grate. It was not a factory. It was a palace. Mrs. Sato scoffed. "A palace? They feed you propaganda, and you swallow it like a gull." "No, it is true," Yuki insisted, her voice rising with the need to be believed. "The floors were like glass, and the clothes, so many. And the lights. But that was not the strangest thing. They have stairs. Ugoku Kaidan. They move. The women at the stove stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "What nonsense is this?" Another woman, a former seamstress, muttered. "Moving stairs? Like a carnival ride?" "Yes. No. It is for people," Yuki tried, gesturing frantically. "You stand still, and it carries you up. A river of metal. We all rode it. Hana-san saw it too." All eyes turned to Hana. She was standing by her bunk, her back to them, in the process of unlacing her boots. She felt the weight of their collective gaze. She knew that if she turned and confirmed Yuki's story, it would be met with scorn. It was too fantastic. It sounded like a child's dream, or the ramblings of a shell-shocked mind. "Yuki is tired," Hana said quietly, not turning around. "She is confusing what she saw." "I am not!" Yuki cried, her voice cracking with betrayal. "Hana-san, tell them. Tell them what we saw. The metal steps, the hum." Hana finally turned. She looked at Yuki's desperate, flushed face. Then she looked at the hard, suspicious faces of Mrs. Sato and the others. They were women who understood starvation. They understood hard labor. They understood death and duty. They could not understand a moving staircase in a building full of perfume. "Get in your bunk, Yuki," Hana said, her voice flat. "It is over." Yuki stared, heartbroken, before turning and fleeing to the dark corner where her bunk lay. Hana sat on the edge of her own cot. She pulled the single, scratchy wool blanket over her legs, the same blanket that, weeks ago, had seemed like a confusing, complex object. How simple it seemed now. It was functional. It was honest. She lay back, staring at the raw wooden slats of the bunk above her. The barrack was silent again, save for the breathing of the sleepers and Yuki's muffled sobs. Hana tried to find the words, just for herself. How to describe the escalator? It was not magic. It was engineering. It was tons of steel, precision gears, and electrical power. It was an engine, but it did not pull a plow, or turn a turbine, or move a tank. It moved shoppers. She realized, with a clarity that felt like ice in her stomach, that her language lacked the words for this concept. This specific, colossal, decadent waste. A nation that could divert that much metal, that much power, that much genius to such a trivial, civilian purpose. A single, devastating thought articulated itself in her mind. How can we possibly win? She felt a profound, cold isolation. It was not just the wire fence that separated her from the Americans. It was this chasm of experience. She was now separated even from her own people. There were those who had seen and those who had not. And there was no way to bridge the gap. The next night, the gray bus arrived at 1900 hours, its brakes hissing in the frozen dark. The 8 women of the detail assembled. Yuki was quiet, her face pale but composed. She kept close to Hana, but her eyes no longer held the look of stark terror. They held a guarded, watchful curiosity. Chio and the others were the same. The night of the moving stairs had changed them. They had crossed a psychological boundary. As they boarded, Hana felt a strange pull. It was not excitement. It was a kind of intellectual hunger, a desire to understand. It frightened her more than the contempt of the civilians or the authority of the guards. She was no longer just a prisoner, enduring. She had become an observer. The bus rumbled through Omaha. This time, Hana did not shrink from the windows. She looked at the neon signs, at the civilians hurrying along the sidewalks, their arms full of paper-wrapped parcels. She saw them not as demons, but as something far more complex. People living in an entirely different reality, a reality of impossible surplus. They arrived at the steel door of the loading dock. Corporal Evans unlocked it. The now familiar scent of beeswax, cedar, and perfume washed over them. It no longer felt like an assault. It felt, unsettlingly, like the smell of work. Evans led them through the stockroom and onto the vast, silent floor. He flicked the work lights on. They walked toward the central atrium, buckets and rags in hand. Hannah looked up toward the heart of the great building, and her stomach dropped. It was silent. The low, oily, omniscient hum was gone. She looked at the Ugoku Kaidan. The moving stairs were still. The grooved metal steps were motionless, frozen in their endless climb. The machine was dark. It was just a staircase now. A strange, inert, metal staircase. Hannah stopped. She felt a profound, illogical, and deeply unsettling pang of disappointment. She had wanted to see it move again. She had wanted to feel that effortless, mechanical glide. She had wanted to confirm that the dream of the previous night had been real. Now it was just cold, dead metal. "What's wrong?" Evans asked. He had walked a few paces ahead before noticing they had stopped. Hannah pointed. "It is not moving." Evans glanced at the escalator. "Oh, yeah, guess they shut it off. Save electricity, maybe. War effort and all." He shrugged, as if it were the most trivial thing in the world. He pointed to the wide, traditional marble staircase, the one they had ignored the night before. "Guess you hoof it." He said it so casually. Save electricity. He had no idea what this machine meant. He had no idea that this single, silent motor was a more powerful piece of propaganda than any poster or speech. To him, it was just a convenience. To her, it was a revelation. Hannah looked at the dead machine. She realized that its power over her did not rely on its movement. Its very existence was enough. Whether it moved or not, it was. It had been built. It existed in the world, and it had changed her. The wool blanket, the hostile town, the indifference of the guards, none of it had broken her. This silent, trivial, magnificent machine had. She turned away from the escalator. She picked up her bucket. "Yuki, Chio, the marble stairs," she said, her voice even. "Tanghai, Chungta ko viek phai lam. Second floor, we have work to do." She began to walk. The others followed. As she passed Corporal Evans, she paused for a fraction of a second. She looked at this young, bored American boy who held a rifle, but whose true power lay in the refrigerators and moving stairs he guarded. Hana Ishii, civilian internee, gave him a short, perceptible nod. A nod of acknowledgement, not of surrender, but of a terrible, new understanding. Corporal Evans, confused but seeing the new resolve in her eyes, instinctively nodded back. Hannah turned and began to climb the cold marble stairs.